Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 167 and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this episode of Foreign Policy Focus, I'm going to be discussing the big changes to Trump's administration. Trump announces on Twitter, of course, that Rex Tillerson will be out at the State Department and he will be nominating Mike Pompeo, who is currently the CIA director, to fill Tillerson's seat. And he will be promoting the deputy director at the CIA, Gina Haspel, up a position, and she will be the new CIA director, assuming she gets confirmed by the Senate. So big news in the Trump administration. I'm going to try to break it down for everyone and maybe elaborate on what it all means and then get into a little bit of Pompeo and Haspel's background to see what we're going to have now as the head of the CIA and the State Department. I guess one of the big pieces of news here is that this does seem to have been done on Twitter. I've been reading that, for a long time, pretty much since Tillerson became Secretary of State, that he was going to be fired as Secretary of State. However, recently there have been some reports that Chief of Staff Kelly has been telling Tillerson that if he doesn't resign, he will be fired. So I'm not sure if maybe the tweet was done as a way to kind of punish Tillerson a little bit for not stepping down and send a message to some of the other people that Kelly may be trying to get rid of in the Trump administration. Or if this is just the way Donald Trump is and he was like, well, this is the easiest way to do it, so I'm just going to do it that way. So I think the reports to say that Rex Tillerson didn't see it coming are probably false. I don't think he was called beforehand and told, hey, this is the Trump tweet that Trump has lined up to be sent out, so just so you know, you're about to be fired. So then we really don't get any more information until we get a 1-minute clip of Trump, who I guess was walking out to a plane. So in the clip I'm going to play, very sorry, the background, the plane noise, I can't get rid of it, so it's going to be a little bit hard to hear what Trump is saying, but I'm going to go ahead and play that clip and then break it down a little bit.
I think Mike Pompeo will be a truly great Secretary of State. I have total confidence in him. And as far as Rex Tillerson is concerned, I very much appreciate his commitment and his service, and I wish him well. He's a good man.
Mr. President, what did you tell Rex? What did you say to Rex?
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently. So we were not really thinking the same. With Mike Pompeo, we have a very similar thought process. I think it's going to go very well. Rex is a very good man. I like Rex a lot. I really appreciate his commitment and his service, and I'll be speaking to Rex over a long period of time.
I guess, of course, we'll just know both here and in the tweet, Trump is trying to at least express some gratitude for the work that Rex Tillerson has done. I'm not sure why Trump filled so much time and space of his tweet with this, but this is something he seems to have emphasized. Then you have the reason that Trump gives for that Tillerson is on his way out, and that is because their disagreement, I guess, as at least an example on the Iran nuclear deal, where Trump, as he says, feels very strongly that it's a bad deal and that we should break that deal, and Tillerson said no, that we should stay in it. The next part, very interesting, and that is that Trump is saying that he believes that Mike Pompeo is in agreement with him on the Iran deal, and that's one of the reasons that he is getting promoted. And so, as I said before, this doesn't come as a huge surprise. Obviously, there's been the disagreements between Tillerson and Trump on the Iran deal, where at times it seems like the two aren't even on the same page and hadn't communicated in the issue at all. They were sending very different signals to the world on what was going to happen with the nuclear deal, and maybe this was one intentionally trying to undermine the other, or just two people not being on the same page, like the example with North Korea, maybe, where we have Tillerson basically offering talks with the North Koreans more or less without precondition, and then Trump pretty immediately slapping that down and saying that no, there are preconditions to the talks. And then I think some of Tillerson's most recent comments on the North Korean situation were that we were a long way from talks, and then the next thing you know, we have Trump accepting talks with Kim. So it doesn't seem like the two are really on the same page, and now we have Pompeo who agrees with him. I'm seeing a lot of the mainstream media here just going to bat and saying that, oh, look, Trump is the guy that surrounds himself with yes men. I've heard this about Trump, and it's probably somewhat true. Here, the case with the State Department, though, I think the Secretary of State is supposed to more or less do the bidding of the president that is there to implement that policy. And then you would look at advisors like H.R. McMaster should be the person that's really disagreeing with Trump here. Not the Secretary of State should be a yes man, but that does seem to be a bit of a different role. However, I think there's a lot more important things to discuss here than whether Trump is just surrounding himself with yes men and talk about the policy that the man is going to say yes to. Of course, that man is current CIA director, former representative, I believe, from Kansas, Mike Pompeo. To go over Mike Pompeo's history a little bit, I think if we go all the way back to 2014, we have him making some very Bannon populist sounding statements where he was talking about how there's kind of an existential struggle between the West and the radical elements from the Islamic world. And that seemed to be the way that he kind of viewed it, in that we have to have the military presence, and probably is a big buyer into this state safe haven myth that so many people in Washington believe, that U.S. troops constantly have to be meddling around the Middle East to prevent threats from being formed up against the United States. As we had the rollout of the Iran nuclear deal, we had the statements Pompeo making on the deal being very much against it. I believe he, said several times that he voted against it when he was actually in Congress. And really throughout the 2016 campaign, and since this has been in place, Pompeo has been somebody that has opposed the Iran nuclear deal and advocated for withdrawal. I'm going to go over some of Pompeo's complaints about the Iran nuclear deal, and I'll go ahead and link to an article in the show notes page that just lists out all the different ones and links to everything. So you guys can click on that if you're interested in reading more about what Pompeo has to say here. It seems that one of Pompeo's underlying beliefs, especially at least before he was CIA director, was that Iran was going to basically be able to build themselves a nuke after the 10 years of the nuclear deal expired, which really isn't the case. What we have with the nuclear deal is an agreement for the American and the Western side to ease sanctions on Iran, and I believe lists some of the sanctions that are UN opposed against Iran, in exchange for Iran agreeing to a additional safeguard agreement to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is kind of the world standard for countries having nuclear weapons or a nuclear energy program. Basically, if you sign on to the NPT, that the world superpowers will go ahead and be willing to sell you nuclear reactors and such, so then you could go ahead and have a nuclear energy program, but you agree that you won't accumulate certain amounts of nuclear waste that could then be used as nuclear weapons one day. So Iran was already within that, but then had all these international sanctions on them. And so in order to relieve those sanctions, they went ahead and agreed to what was known as the P5+1 deal, where you have the UN Security Council plus Germany signing an agreement with Iran to relieve sanctions, in addition for Iran making additional sanctions or additional concessions on their nuclear energy program, in addition to what the Non-Proliferation Treaty requires all countries that sign to it abide by. Signing on to this deal meant that Iran was going to destroy their heavy water reactor. This is the reactor that produces the waste that could be most easily used to make a nuclear weapon. And Iran also agreed to limit the amount of heavy water that they have, and then also limit the amount of centrifuges they have. Centrifuges, of course, are used to spin down the nuclear waste to make more concentrated or pure material there, that if you get it high enough enriched, I think you could turn it into a nuclear weapon. But if it's just at a lower level, you can enrich it to the point where it's more efficient to use in your energy reactors. So anyways, what the deal did was, in exchange, like I've said before, Iran agrees to the additional protocols on their nuclear energy program, and the Western or the international community lifts sanctions on Iran. Now, this deal, a lot of the portions of the deal are set to expire after 10 years, and this would allow Iran to increase their nuclear energy capabilities to those allowed within the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but Iran would still remain in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Also, after this period of time, the United States could go to the UN and try to put all these international sanctions back on Iran if they so choose to, and the United States could independently sanction Iran after that time without an agreement. This isn't the only agreement the West or the United States can make with Iran. We could absolutely make a agreement that we wouldn't attack Iran. We could make a missile agreement with Iran on top of this. but in exchange for certain sanctions being relieved, Iran is limiting their nuclear energy program under this deal. Everybody has sold it though as this will just allow Iran to get nuclear weapons, and obviously if you look at the deal and what it actually is, that just isn't the case. It's a misleading and completely wrong right-wing talking point. So despite what you hear, this in no way guarantees that the Iranians will have a nuclear weapon. Some of Pompeo's other complaints about the deal is that he says the Iranians really didn't give up anything and now they have all the sanctions relief, so they're able to make all this money. That's really not true. As I point out, they closed and they destroyed their heavy water reactor. I think they actually poured concrete into the reactor. And this, severely limits Iran's nuclear energy program, but definitely makes it a much further path for them to get nuclear weapons than they had before the agreement was met. And so it's not like Iran didn't give anything away up front. Pompeo complains that Iran supports terrorist groups. If you look at the groups that, Iran is alleged to support, mainly the Houthis and Hezbollah, as the Iraqi militias have now really refolded into the Iraqi army, at least in name. And it seems that Iran has lost some of their influence in Iraq. These are not terrorist groups. The Houthis are having a war waged against them by the Saudis and outside power trying to foist a government on the people of Yemen that the people of Yemen, at least in the north, aren't agreeing to. And Hezbollah was, of course, formed as a reaction to the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. And Iran and Lebanon have a common enemy, and so for that reason they share an alliance. But it's not like Hezbollah is Al-Qaeda running around blowing themselves up and cutting people's heads off. That it's just not an equal thing to compare. And Hezbollah is not a terrorist group. They're a group that definitely opposes the way the Israelis or the Saudis or the United States wishes the Middle East to be, but that is far different than a terrorist organization. Another myth that Pompeo brings up about Iran is that Rouhani has no power in Iran, despite the fact that Rouhani was elected in a pretty popular election. Rouhani, of course, is the elected leader, I believe the prime minister of Iran, whereas you have the Ayatollah and the IRGC, who are the more hardline, unelected religious aspects of the Iranian government. However, Rouhani in the prime minister position has a lot of power in Iran and was even able to negotiate the nuclear deal with Barack Obama. This was certainly driven by the Rouhani factions of the government and not the hardline right-wing factions of the government. And this is something also worth pointing out while we're talking about the factions of the Iranian government. You absolutely have people within the Iranian government who say things like death to America and they want to destroy America. And I think they're misquoted a little bit on the Israeli quote, but I'm sure you could find members of the IRGC or the hardline right-wing groups in Iran who will say terrible things about Israelis and Jewish people. But remember, we have this in all countries around the world. I mean, if you look at the United States, we have Ted Cruz, a presidential candidate, up there on the stage talking about turning parts of the Middle East into glass. I mean, he's talking about committing genocide, right? And so if the Iranians are over there saying that we need to take offensive action against America because of what Ted Cruz was saying on the Republican debate stage in 2016, Americans would think, no, you really got that wrong. Like, Ted Cruz doesn't represent that, and that doesn't mean that's going to happen to you. So we need to see the same thing on their side, that there's some politics involved here. After becoming the CIA director, Pompeo seems to have been at least turned down the rhetoric a little bit on some of the Iran nuclear deal discussions. When he was asked directly at a conference if Iran was violating the nuclear deal or the JCPOA, which is the Joint Congressional Plan of Action, which was America's Congress way of certifying the Iran nuclear deal, he really dodges the question and then goes to other things, saying that how Iran is supporting the Houthis and Hezbollah and how Iran has this missile program. Of course, what's typically cited against Iran in their missile program is that saying that it's violating the spirit of the deal for Iran to have this missile program. It doesn't say in the deal that Iran needs to negotiate with a hostile American government on their missile program. A lot of this, I think, is overworked and overbuilt too. A lot of times now, since I don't think Iran is actually carrying out additional tests to extend their missile range, they're looking at pointing to Iran's space program as a way that they're increasing their weapons and saying they're violating the deal. However, as I talked about in a previous episode, the technology used to launch a satellite into space is pretty far different than the technology used to build a missile that could carry a warhead to hit a target up on Earth. And so it seems that once Pompeo became the head of the CIA, he at least understood that Iran actually isn't violating the nuclear deal as written. Now, one of the misconceptions that Pompeo seems to have about the Iran nuclear deal, even after becoming CIA director, is he thinks that the Iran nuclear deal was supposed to do everything. It was supposed to limit the missile program. It was supposed to combat the Iranian influence in the Middle East. He talks about Iran becoming a Middle East hegemon, which simply isn't true. I'm guessing that the United States has more troops in more different Middle Eastern countries than Iran actually does. And so, I mean, we're the world empire complaining about Iran having some influence in its neighboring states because it was fighting ISIS. But simply put, the JCPOA was only passed as a way to limit Iran's nuclear energy program in a way that would make it more difficult for them to get nuclear weapons. I guess that's the other thing worth talking about is that Pompeo seems to believe that the United States needs to be involved in Syria to counter Iranian influence in the Middle East. He seems to have the general neocon idea, the Shia Crescent, which is the theory that if Assad stays in power in Syria, the Iranians will have a land bridge from Tehran all the way to Beirut and then be able to attack Israel. I mean, of course, this is ridiculous. The reason that Iran has a friendly state next door in Iraq is because of the 2003 intervention when we went and killed Saddam Hussein, Iran's long enemy. And then, of course, that sparked a Sunni jihadist insurgency that spread all the way into Syria and eventually became ISIS and put both Assad in Syria and the Iraqi government in need of a force to come and fight ISIS. And Iran and eventually Russia and Hezbollah all came to the aid of those powers to fight for them. And so the extending influence was only a result of U.S. action in the Middle East. And the idea that for all these years Iran hasn't been able to supply Hezbollah is ridiculous anyways. There's sea routes to this, there's air routes to this. I'm sure they've been able to smuggle the weapons around in the past. I mean, ISIS was selling millions of dollars worth of oil. And so it's ridiculous to think that Iran couldn't get some weapons to people if they wanted to. And so just in a very recent interview, I believe March 11th on Face the Nation, we had Pompeo who was saying just that one of the reasons that we need to be in Iran is to counter, or Syria is to counter Iran. This is worth noting because there's a small number of ISIS fighters, well, small relative to the strength of ISIS before, still existing in the desert area around the border of Iraq and Syria. And the United States-backed force in Syria, the YPG or the SDF, have abandoned the fight against ISIS to go fight Turkey, who's invading Syria in the Afrin area. And so right now we have a potential to take out ISIS in this area. We see the United States not doing it. And it seems awfully convenient that the ISIS being in Syria gives us the excuse to stay in Syria, and then we're preventing other forces from taking out these troops because, of course, the United States being in this area means that the Assad allied forces can't attack ISIS in that area. Last thing I want to talk about with Pompeo here is just his position on Edward Snowden, which is completely terrifying. And I'm going to go ahead and play a clip. I believe this is him on a C-SPAN show before he was CIA director.
Would have been at risk if they'd been on a .gov account. It's absolutely the case that we have not been able to secure all the American information that we needed to, and that we've had the traitor Edward Snowden steal that information. He should be brought back from Russia and given due process, and I think the proper outcome would be that he would be given a death sentence for having put friends of mine, friends of yours who serve in the military today at enormous risk because of the information he stole and then released to foreign powers.
So I think there's quite a few very important things here. First is they immediately label Snowden a traitor, obviously doesn't believe in due process. This is a guy who I'm sure wears an American flag pin on his lapel everywhere he goes. And yet he doesn't believe in, basic Bill of Rights type civil liberties that everybody should have due process. But nope, Snowden's a traitor. He claims that Snowden put people at risk by leaking the information to foreign powers. First of all, he didn't give it to foreign powers. He gave the information to journalists. And so I don't know if Pompeo was just outright lying there or is confused or misled, but that was just obviously incorrect information. Also, it didn't put anybody at risk. Snowden leaked the information to fairly responsible sources like Glenn Greenwald, who are vetting the information and not just publishing the names of U.S. spies or anything like that, like Pompeo claims. I think his general claim would be the fact that the information became public that everybody was being spied on by the United States government allowed everybody to know that they're being spied on by the United States government. If you know you're being spied on, I guess that adds to your tactical abilities. To go around and avoid getting spied on. Of course, what's known exposed here was a massive violation of the rights of all of us American people who are now having themselves spied on by the American government. There was never any debate on this issue or anything like that. And that's what Snowden attempted to provide the American people, is a chance to voice their opinion on one of the, Bill of Rights amendments being stripped away. And finally, the thing that, Pompeo wants to execute him, and that's just so disturbing to me, is that you would see this as, Snowden's a guy who thought he was doing the right thing by the American people. And I guess Pompeo can agree with that or disagree with that. But to think that Snowden needs to die for that is kind of sick to me. But this goes along with Pompeo's thinking. I believe as CIA director, he has talked about WikiLeaks being a hostile intelligence agency and not just a publication that publishes verified but leaked information. Last thing I want to mention, I don't know what I didn't think that Pompeo was all that pro-peace on the North Korea issue as CIA director. However, I guess he does have and has talked about Kim Jong-un being a rational actor and seems to not be super hawkish on the North Korean ICBM abilities, saying that the North Koreans are still a few months away. I'm sure that if he really wanted to, he could come up with a report saying that they had the ability to bomb Los Angeles right now. And most people would believe it. So at least we have some minor amounts of non-terribleness on the nuclear Korea issue from Pompeo. But in that interview on Face the Nation pretty recently, we did have him saying that I guess he plans to go along with the plans for talks. I'm guessing since that was March 11th and the firing of Tillerson happened on March 13th, he had a pretty good idea this was coming. Last, I want to talk about Gina Haspel, who will now be the director of the CIA, assuming that she is confirmed. She's a career CIA agent, starting with the agency in 1985. I think she's done an awful lot of time in the field as undercover. In 2002, she was running a CIA site in Thailand where detainees were sent that were picked up across the Middle East in the wake of 9/11. Detainees at her site and under, her authority, I would suppose, since she was running the site, were waterboarded repeatedly. One detainee, Abu Zabeda, was waterboarded, I read 83 or 86 times in a single month before they finally acknowledged that he didn't have any information. I think he was beaten a few times too. One of the more disturbing things that I've seen today is that MSNBC, in their analysis of Gina Haspel, didn't put that she oversaw the waterboarding and torture of people at the CIA site. They put rough treatment of detainees. So, disturbing stuff there. Later, she was promoted to the CIA headquarters building and given more authority, and then ordered those tapes of her site carrying out those tortures to be deleted and destroyed. So she'd covered up the evidence of her own crimes. Of course, this was all done under the authority and presidency of George W. Bush, who was absolutely a war criminal as well. It's very unfortunate that we now have to deal with this woman possibly being the CIA director because Barack Obama didn't punish her for her crimes and said, we're just going to forget it and move on. Last thing I'll mention about her is that apparently she played a pretty important role in the Extraordinary Rendition Program, which was where we were not only sending detainees to American sites to be interrogated, tortured, but sent to places like Syria and Libya, and I believe Egypt as well, to be tortured. And so if you can imagine how Americans acted hands off, you can imagine the brutal things that were occurring in these dictatorships. And this was all done, like I said, under the eye of Gina Haspel. You have all these people today talking about how, well, she did her duty when she was asked to. And it's like, it is, I guess, one thing to do your duty when it's something that's not that bad, but to authorize torture of somebody repeatedly is completely unexcusable. And obviously, she can't be CIA director. That's too much authority to have from somebody who already has very questionable moral standards. All right, I think that's what I have for y'all today. That's where I'm going to wrap up the show. I hope you enjoyed it. Tried to cover everything going on in the Trump administration. I mean, it was a pretty crazy day overall. You'd never expect, I guess, the day that the CIA or the Secretary of State gets fired. But there we have it. All right. So share the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. New website is immersionnews.com. Check that out if you want to donate to the show and then get access to the bonus episodes of the Matt's Boot Show that I do where I debunk Matt Boot's articles. Think about donating. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. On Twitter at KYAAALE. If you guys have a chance to check it out, my article that I co-authored with Will Porter on the Afghan war and the effects of the opium trade there is up as a spotlight on antiwar.com. So that's really cool. And thanks to the people at antiwar.com for running it up there.